Hello and welcome. I'm Tafarag Adamu. The tourism sector is tremendously dynamic, but is it in Ethiopia? My guest today, Tony Hickey, one of the tour operators in this country, says the sector needs attention, plenty of attention. Tony Hickey, a very warm welcome to the program.
Thank you.
How many years have you done this business in Ethiopia? 24, 25 years?
Well, yes, post fall of Mengistu, but I first came here in 1973, and I drove backpackers up and down at a time when there were only 23 or 24 million Ethiopians. I drove down from Itsawa to Kenya. I came back again. So back in the last days of the emperor, I had done a bit of tourism, but the serious stuff has been post Mengistu.
Well, that's when you basically started the tour operation business. First hired as a manager by a company, and years later you established your own business, right?
Yeah.
So you're pretty much a very well-placed person to talk about the industry. Is that a correct assessment?
Well, yes, I've seen massive change over the years, And people tend to, or maybe not to forget, but not to realize that tourism was happening here in the last days of the emperor. American tourists were coming as companies. There were tour groups were flying into Axum, and there were foreign tour companies based up in the north, like UTC. So tourism was happening then, and you can say at that time, 1973, 74.
Only a couple or three tour operators, right?
Well, yeah, there weren't so many, but the tourism sector was equal to that of Kenya at that time. But then,
I can understand that. What do you mean? What do you mean?
Well, in terms of numbers, hotels, tourists arriving.
The numbers of tourists coming is basically much that the Kenyans had at that point in time.
At that time.
Interesting. Okay, I didn't know that. So, of course, for 17 years, war, and all this talk about famine and hunger, was not, it didn't make Ethiopia the destination. Is that safe to say? For about 17 years, there were tourists coming, but not in that.
The only tourists who really continue to come were the bird watchers, you can't put them off, as it were. They continue to come throughout the Mengistu period, but obviously most of the north, the historic route, was out of bounds, and so tourism took a massive dive. But also, as you mentioned, the famine image, which we're kind of shedding now, but it's still there. When I was starting tourism back in the 90s, and I mentioned having a brochure printed for Ethiopia, the woman laughed at me over the phone. She thought I was joking. It was like a joke. Who'd go to Ethiopia for a holiday? And unfortunately, many of the aid agencies, Live Aid, Band Aid, they sustained that by launching the 5th anniversary, the 10th anniversary, 15th anniversary. And every time there was an anniversary, they'd flash up what has been called famine porn, starving babies, And so that was very, very difficult to shake off. But there's been so much publicity about Ethiopia, travelogues, National Geographic, History Channel, others from all over the world, that people now do have a slightly different...
And that started basically happening about 10 to 15 years ago?
Yeah. Yes, more or less like that. Yeah. Post the war with Eritrea and so on, tourism started to climb then.
So is it fair to say that Ethiopia is one of the great destinations, few top destinations in Africa?
Well, yes. It's been acknowledged by companies such as Lonely Planet and so on, and Ethiopia, the top destination. It is definitely one of the top destinations. Because of its mix, the scenery, the culture, historical sites. It can't compete in terms of safaris and the big five, but in all other aspects, it definitely can compete.
The mix is quite an attraction, that was saying, yeah. So what kind of tourists do we have in this country? Very few high-end,
Well, actually, most of the visitors to Ethiopia tend to be middle-aged and slightly better off, because it's most of the visitors come for the historic route. Most of the vacation tourists, probably 60-65%, come for the historic route, and that attracts a certain type of traveller, he or she is not a beach bum hanging out on the beach for 2 weeks sunbathing, or golf. It's a very specific destination in that sense. You don't say, well, shall I go to Ethiopia or Ghana? There's something which would draw you here specifically, and the people who come tend to have read something about it. So that's like the biggest chunk. But then, as I mentioned, there's a very loyal chunk of bird watchers, because Ethiopia has some 850 species.
And 24, 25 of them endemic.
Yeah, so that's there. And also that's the loyal segment. But then there's also the trekkers, Simeon Mountain, Bali Mountains, and the ethnic tourism in the Omo Valley, people that come to watch or to see these tribal groups that decorate themselves, paint their bodies, and so on.
And conferences, are they making any difference as far as?
No, conferences is becoming huge. It's really becoming huge. And I mean, the irony was, under the previous administration in the Ethiopian Revenue and Customs Authority, they said conference tourism wasn't really tourism. And in a way, they were almost discouraging it. There was a very bizarre episode at the 50th anniversary of the founding of the African Union, or as it was, the OAU, the 50th anniversary founding of the OAU. Customs officials were arresting cars with delegates.
I mean, your cars.
Yeah, tour operators' cars, because they said people who come for conferences aren't tourists.
Well, you have to explain here. Because they allowed you to import the four-wheel drives, right, duty-free, and you can only use them for tourists, right?
Yeah, but...
So they didn't consider conference participants tourists, so if you use your vehicles to transport them, it's illegal, right? That's why they were...
That's why they were doing it, but the point is, under the World Tourism Organization definition, and Ethiopia is a founding member, so the articles that it signed up for is part and parcel, or are part and parcel of the Ethiopian constitution. And by their definition, if you spend more, or less than a year, more than an unspecified amount of time in a country other than your own, you're a tourist. And so a conference tourist, they come and consume the same things as someone doing the historic route. They'll stay in a hotel, they'll eat in a restaurant, they'll buy some souvenirs perhaps, they'll take taxis. So, I mean, conference tourism is a very good payer, and it needs to be encouraged.
So who uses your services? I mean, conference tourists are not necessarily using your offices to facilitate their visas and so on.
Some of them might. I mean,
but in large measures, their embassies and so on handle those.
But there are also certain companies which specialize in setting up conferences, and now that in Addis there are very good facilities. Right. Like the ECA and so on. And even a lot of hotels have really beefed up their capacity to hold, meetings. We do some arrangements for conferences. Now there's coming up the East African Paleoanthropological and Paleontological Association, which we are assisting with. A lot of them, the NGOs, will do it themselves. They'll set it up. The organizations here will set up their own conferences.
Ethiopia has this vision, right, as far as tourism is concerned. When is it? In 2020, they want to hit a certain mark or stuff like that. Does that make sense to you?
Well, it's not bad to have targets, but simply a target without asking yourself, who will be the real beneficiaries? How do we maximize benefits? How do we maximize employment? How do we maximize youth employment? How do we create extra opportunities for income generation? Simply setting a target doesn't really help you like that. And what I think has been missing at the heart of tourism policy is a political understanding of tourism, or let's say an ideological understanding, just as the EPRDF developed an ideological critique of agricultural development, industrial development, rural development, even health, and so on. There are policies which are essentially springing from certain ideological principles about serving the people and maximizing benefits for people. But the tourism it's been kind of neglected in this sense because
I would say it's been neglected because all these commitments that you've just mentioned in industry, in agriculture, and so on are in large measure meant to kind of push the agenda of tourism forward in a way.
they do, but that doesn't mean we can't have a political analysis of tourism, because tourism, people say it's a smokeless industry. It isn't. It's as polluting as any other. It pollutes, in terms of, the exhaust fumes from the cars that we use. And also there's the cultural pollution, which you see in many countries, sex tourism and so on.
What do you mean when you say a kind of a political ideological?
What I think needed to have been done was to study other countries, learn from the best, lessons and avoid the worst mistakes. And you'd try to structure it to minimize expatriation of profit. Obviously, that's going to happen because when international brands come in, they want to expatriate or repatriate their profits. But you can do things in many ways. You can encourage, just as the government is encouraging small and medium industries. One practical example, the Omo Valley. People go down there to consume people. Well, what should have happened over the last 10 or 15 years was capacity building for the people of the Omo to put up their own lodges, as they've done in some, for example, neighbouring Kenya, the Maasai run their own lodges. This, we could have done it here.
There are only a few, but most of them are run by private business people.
They are.
I mean, even in the Masai Mara. Right?
Yeah. I mean, I'm not.
But there are community lodges,
Yes,
right? That's
there
what
are.
we're talking about. Yes.
That's what I'm saying. We could have done more of this type of thing, and there are other.
But in terms of policy, do you think that we don't have the policy as far as tourism is concerned? I guess we have. We have we have the instruments, basically the institutions meant to kind of help implement those policies, like the Ethiopian Tourism Organization is interested in branding in Ethiopia, and you have the Ethiopian Ministry of Culture and Tourism, and so on and so forth. There are plenty of institutions involved here, including the Ethiopian Tourism Council that is chaired by the Prime Minister.
Yeah.
So we have lots of things happening now.
There, certainly, I don't want to minimize this. There's been a massive progress in tourism, but I still believe we need to have some type of political direction, where we're going and why. Because do we say we want more tourists, we want more tourists? I mean, there are many... some negative aspects, for example. In areas like Lalibela or Axum, there are water shortages. How do you take this? Do you really take this into account when you're planning? And also, certain sites, again like the churches of Lalibela, cannot take huge numbers of visitors tramping in and out. Have we established carrying capacities? I mean, it's not these. These sort of heritages have to be preserved as well for Ethiopians for all time, not just for foreign visitors. And so these types of decisions have to be made. That with tourism, you don't just unleash it to run around freely, but you've got to say there has to be certain limits set, for environmental, cultural purpose and so on.
Who do you think should take the lead?
EPRDF.
At an institution level, yes. I mean, the government, you're right, but...
Well, obviously the ministry is there, the Ministry of Culture and Tourism is there, but, unless the political heavyweights in the EPRDF say, yes, look, we've studied tourism, we've slightly neglected it because we've given priority to industry and agriculture. Now we want to frame a tourism policy which will bring the following results. And I think that's what's missing, because it seems to be reactive more than proactive, the tourism policy. There are policies there. People have studied it very well. There are many papers out there that have been produced over the years. And as you say, there's the Tourism Council. But whether these institutions have the dynamism to transform the sector, this is what I'm not so sure about.
But you're talking about individuals, not institutions, when you say there need to be heavyweights to run this institution, or one way or the other.
Well, it's not only that, but I mean, in terms of, like we have Made in Africa. This is the policy for industry, that we don't have to follow the industrial path of other countries. And you can do the same with tourism. You can say, well, we don't want to necessarily have the same tourism sector as, for example, Gambia. I'm not saying that.
But you don't have to reinvent the wheel, should you?
The studies are there. I mean, that's been done. It's just that we'd have to look carefully what's happened right so far, and a lot of things have, as I said, there's been huge progress, particularly in infrastructure. But, for example, someone wants to build a hotel in a prestige tourist site. Should he or she be allowed to build the building they want, or should there be controls? Because even in capitalist Europe, the most capitalist countries, you can't build simply as you like. There's planning. You have to have planning permission. Does it fit in with the environment? All of these things have got to be there. And so developers, often with the best will in the world, they think, let me put up a hotel in my hometown. But without advice, they come up with some very ugly structures,
Right.
and which aren't really fit in terms of room size or provision of water. I mean, there are certain standards which should have been adhered to. And that was a huge problem here in Addis when they started the Star Hotels. A lot of hotels had no fire escapes, and the government shouldn't have licensed the building of those hotels without checking this out. And this type of involvement by the government has got to come from a deeper commitment. They've got to say, look, we have to do this properly. If there's someone's going to build a lodge, we have to look, how does it fit in with the environment? Are they taking account of the best practices in terms of, renewable energy, treatment of waste, and all of these things? As you said, it's there. All that information's out there.
You need an institution who can go ahead and do it.
Yes.
Have you been affected? Well, you've been tremendously affected by the recent riots, right?
Yeah. I mean,
these are your traditional tourist routes.
yes, and
You were not ready for that, right?
no.
And when it happened, it kind of months of planning
Overnight.
went down the drain.
That's it. I mean, there was, like all companies here, we faced massive cancellations. And even, tours that had been planned a year in advance were all cancelled. Essentially because a negative traveller, if you ignore a negative travel advisory from your government, you won't be able to benefit from travel insurance. So even if you have an injury or an accident totally unrelated with the rioting,
You're not covered.
protests, yeah, you could fall in the bathroom, break your wrist, you could have food poisoning, you're not covered. So eventually, even when things calmed down, and I was telling people, look, things are very calm now, they said, Tony, we believe you, but we cannot go against this travel insurance because any one, bad incident, a traffic accident, as a company where we'd face huge liabilities. So this has, slowly they did start to lift the travel advisories, and a lot of them are very exaggerated.
What do you mean exaggerated? Because they come up with facts.
Well, it was some of them weren't facts because with one, I don't necessarily want to embarrass them, but with one European country, they said tourists had been threatened in their hotels, and this hadn't happened. In fact, the only foreigner who was killed in all that rioting was the American agricultural research student, and in a sense that was an accident. But tourists weren't targeted.
Do you think that's very unusual, only to Ethiopia?
It's not unusual in the Ethiopian context because I've having witnessed protests and demonstrations, and in the time of the emperor and later in Ethiopia, because there's no sort of foreign hand or colonial master behind it all, they don't blame foreigners for what they see as an Ethiopian problem. They blame the government, and so foreigners will be there, and they because we even had, at the height of disturbances in Bale, where they were stopping public transport and buses, they declared a strike. Buses with tourists were allowed to pass. When they saw that there were, a bunch of bird watchers, they waved them past. And so this...
It wasn't a problem if they were in town. The problem is how would they get to this country?
That's the thing. That's the whole thing. But in a way, you look at Europe over the last year, it suffered much more, devastating terrorist type of attacks, with people killed than Ethiopia, but still perceptions, like it's a dangerous country and so on. They persist.
Are you recovering?
Slowly, that looks good. I mean, again, as I said, the loyalist tourists, the bird watchers, we have bookings for them next year, and people have asked about, is the historic route okay now? Yeah, I said it's been okay since. And so it's slowly, it's coming back. But it's when people cancel their holidays, it's not like throwing a light switch. They'll book another country. They'll say, let's go to Costa Rica or Burma or something, And then, so it takes time to recover. It can take, up to a year or more, to recover.
But as much as it poses quite a serious challenge to the industry, this is also an opportunity for you in the industry to look into domestic tourism. Do we have the market for domestic tourism? Because the Kenyans, years ago, when they had this aspect of terrorist attacks, they kind of, and their industry hit rock bottom. What they did was they shifted all the tour operators to domestic tourism.
Simply before coming to the domestic tourism, it did also let people focus on why are we focusing simply on Europe and the States and some other countries like Japan. Let's look for markets elsewhere. So that it did push people to start thinking out of the box. But with domestic tourism, domestic tourism in Ethiopia is gigantic in that the pilgrimages dwarf all other movements. 100,000 people going to Gabriel Kalubi, 100,000 to Mariam Zion. And it's always happening throughout the year. There are pilgrimages taking place. People are moving to visit, even remote churches somewhere in the countryside where they happen to have been born. So this is there. The thing is, and then, with this growing middle class and so on, people are going down the Rift Valley at the weekend to Langano. They're going up to Salulta for the, the Edge and the Ibs and so on. So this is there. The only thing is for us in the tourism sector, Ethiopians tend to do this by themselves rather than hiring agencies.
Why? Because you're expensive?
Could be that.
Can't you look into that? Probably. That's why I'm saying this could be an opportunity for you to revisit the way you do things.
We have tried this, by the way, and we've contacted different institutions offering, trips out of the Rift Valley. And many years ago, I used to take, when I had a partnership in Bilen Lodge, we took the staff of different ministries there down to the Afar region. So we have tried it, and obviously we can keep trying it. As you say, there's price sensitivity involved. As a company, we have constant, we have overheads, we run an office and so on. So if they go out and hire a coaster bus from somebody, it could be cheaper than ours because that guy doesn't have the same overheads, he doesn't have the salaries to maintain and so on. It's something that has to be really, measured and looked at.
Well, great. That's about it. Tony, it was a pleasure having you on my show again. Thank you very much indeed.
Okay, thank you.